But first, let's talk about love is the plan is death. Any just immediate responses or reactions to this story?
I thought it was really fun. Um, it was, yeah, at first, like the first few paragraphs, I was thinking like, oh, do I really want to be like reading from this point of view for the whole story? But it quickly kind of hooked me and
Hmm.
got me curious to learn what was going on with this species.
Nice. What was the hook?
Mm, I think it was so when the narrator first started talking about the firebug, uh, the I guess the what ended up becoming its mate. Um, at first, I the way that it was talking about it was like um, I had the idea that it was a story of like a first person perspective story about dragons because I thought that the way that I guess maybe the narrator was a he and maybe the mate was a she, although it was confusing because he thought he was a mother for a long time. Um, so he called her things like firebug and stuff like that, and there seemed to be this symbiotic relationship between them. And so I thought that maybe it was like, oh, eventually he's gonna breathe fire with the help of this little symbiotic like creature that lives inside his throat.
Mm.
I didn't really understand. It took me a while to figure out like exactly what was like. Was it inside? Was he carrying her around inside his body, or I didn't
Right.
really understand that.
Yeah, it's to the type of story, at least for me, it was the type of story that I didn't totally understand what was going on until I finished it. And then things made more sense in hindsight, which
Yeah,
is a style. Like it's a choice that people make. What did other people think?
I am curious to hear people's insights because I don't know if it ever fully connected. Like I still had a lot of questions at the end of like,
Mm-hmm.
wait, what exactly are they? And yeah, there was I was I was pretty confused. Um, so yeah, those are my thoughts.
Got it. Uh, then I'll ask this: Was this every was this anyone's first experience with a story, a piece of fiction that didn't have humans in it or humanoid creatures?
It no, never mind.
I,
I
I
was
think
thinking yes, maybe, but then like I used to read Guardians of Gahul and they were all like owls, so I
Mm-hmm.
guess that counts, right?
the only other one I can think of where the whole piece of fiction didn't have any humanoids was one that I stopped reading halfway through because I couldn't take it.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't so much of it because of that. It was the Clockwork Rocket by Greg Egan, where like the whole universe is like kind of what if the laws of physics are slightly different,
Mm-hmm.
and I it was too much for me to keep on, but but with that one, like all of the creatures are very different.
Yeah.
But it kind of reminds me another one um, uh, that I really liked that was kind of first person perspective of a very non humanoid species was Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. Starts out with first person perspective of these like telepathic dog creatures that uh, you don't quite know what's going on at first, but you realize at some point that the first person perspective is actually of like the whole pack of these things as kind of a hive mind,
Mm-hmm.
which is
That's
pretty fun.
cool.
Yeah.
Anyone else? So I'll say I knew I wanted to assign a story that didn't have any humanoids, and I actually had trouble finding one that fit the bill. But it seems like you're more familiar with these types of fiction stories than I am. Andy, any experience reading non-humanoid fiction? Oh, you're muted.
I'm sure I have, but I'm blanking on any specific titles right now. I'm trying to just look around all the bookshelves in my room and see if there's any jumping out at me. Not at present, but I'm sure there must have been.
Yeah. Does it feel different to read a story without humans? Did you find you had a harder time relating to the characters?
At first I did, for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I would have like been into it for a whole like novel length story, but you know, it works when I'm just spending like a little bit of time in his point of view, like what the voice was like, because so many of the phrasing and words were like you know, concepts that didn't it was unclear what I was supposed to take away from it, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Your experience reading something without humanoid characters?
Yeah, it definitely requires a little bit more work at the front end just to kind of get on board with what's happening. Like by the time you kind of get into the story and realize, you know, what's happening and what things are alluding to, it becomes easier, and then you can relate it back to yourself. But at first, especially with a different style of talking, it is very alien.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What extra work do you think the writer had to do? Also, I don't know if any of you looked into this, but James Tiptree Jr. is an alias for a woman named Alice Sheldon, which I found pretty cool. So what extra work do you think the author had to do to get you immersed in this story that didn't have characters you didn't automatically know how the character worked, or how their emotions worked, if they had any, or how their biology worked, or how their social structure worked?
I think the thing that sort of grounded me was I mean, it's like it's in the title, but the dimensions of the plan and the way that it came up, that helped me kind of have something to latch onto as like a reference point, since it was so foreign. Like it was like, obviously this isn't a human. I don't know what kind of creature this is. I don't know what kind of world, big, small. And I was trying to figure that out as I was reading, which probably distracted from me being able to just sort of engage in the story. But yeah, I think coming up with something like that as like the sort of core like thing that this species thinks about, or the core like what it is like to exist as this species. I'm sure there was like a good amount of thought put into that.
Yeah. Did you have any questions that weren't answered by the time you finished about this species? Like burning questions. We don't know everything about this species, but did you feel like there were some gaps or holes in the story?
I mean, I feel like we got enough for what the story wanted us to get, but I'm sitting there thinking, are you an animal? Are you sentient? Are you a dominant species? Are you this or that? But it's not super important to the story, so it's never gone into. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to know more, but I think not knowing doesn't hamper the story.
Yeah. How much of your human experience do you feel you projected onto this species?
I mean, I guess in the grand scheme of things, the way that the species was presented as being very different from humans, I kind of feel like relative to that, I feel like I brought, way too much of my human perspective to it, because how could I not, like,
Yeah.
um, it, so I guess that's kind of, to your earlier question, like part of the work that the author did of like, making us feel okay with that. And I think that was done partially by like the viewpoint character being, um, basically knowing it as little as we do at the beginning. The At the beginning, the viewpoint character is very confused about what's going on in life, um, and so it kind of works then, because it's like I'm right there with you, like.
Yeah, that's super strategic. And other little things like using the word mate instead of wife or partner or lover or whatever to describe this relationship makes it seem more animal. And so you're less likely to ascribe like human emotion to it. And other word choices, other storytelling choices can help limit the amount of projection that your audience will put onto your story, if that's something that you want to avoid. So you can be careful about how you choose those words. Uh, any other thoughts on this? I want to keep this part of the class short, so we have a lot of time at the end to talk about our worlds and how they're coming along. But if you have thoughts, feel free to share them. Okay. What about the video? About aliens, whether or not they're humanoid, why humanoid aliens are so common in science fiction. What are your reactions to that video?
I actually really love that. The author I recommended a couple weeks ago, Becky Chambers, her book has a character that writes about how strange it is that, with the exception of two of the species in the world they inhabit, everyone evolved, one brain, appendages, a spine, a brain at all, that kind of thing, and how it's a question they've never answered. And in another one of her books, the astronauts take a minute to explain that on Earth, something like the spine only evolved once, because everything with the spine had a common ancestor, and the planet they're on now, it's not the case, and it's fascinating to them.
Nice.
So beyond it's cheap for the makeup department, it's always cool to see what people think about that.
Mm-hmm. Would any of you ever consider writing something or creating a piece of art where the central character wasn't humanoid? If there are characters at all.
I don't see why not.
What do you see being the challenges with it?
I think it could be hard to have something that's not humanoid, but that's also not like, you talked about the distinction between like something that's more animal-esque versus human. So if you take it out of the human elements, it's default is, it's be kind of hard to do that without, projecting some human tendencies or, human humanness into it.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it would be hard to just kind of start from scratch there.
Yeah, I think going into it and not assuming that what you're writing has even the same base goals of life as we do is going to be very difficult. The fact aside that he's a terrible person, Orson Scott Card's Speaker for the Dead is really, really great at that with the two alien species he's read up. And I remember reading that as a kid, and before I learned he was a horrible human being, and just being so incredibly wowed at, you know, the different types of life he thought up.
Mm. Yeah. Any other potential challenges?
One thing that I think about sometimes is like how, I guess, what the dialogue is like, which, you know, some of you have already touched on, but like I have this sense that like if I'm writing characters that are however distant from us and our culture, like even if they're not inhuman, but just like distant from us, how there's this sense of like, if I go to great lengths to make their dialogue this other kind of dialogue that is like, yeah, you know, naturally emerging from their circumstances and their nature, maybe, then it seems like it can be very like a very serious kind of piece of writing about these characters. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's like, you know, there's stories where the author makes it like basically like our current day dialogue
Mm-hmm.
with these like recently I read, or it was on a episode of the podcast Radio Lab, actually. At the end of it, it was this episode about these crabs that get like their blood taken from them by big companies for the medical purposes. It's an interesting episode, and it's a very big operation that I didn't know about. And at the end of it, one of the people working on the episode like read this story that I think she wrote from the point of view of one of these crabs, and but it was like she was like asking you to imagine the crab as having like, I forget what it was, like a New Jersey accent or something. And so it was like, it was funny, you know, it ended up being funny, but also, you know, at times poignant. But I find like there's this spectrum, like it would be easier if I could just like write the dialogue like we talk to each
Mm-hmm.
other, but then it's like forced to be like a funny thing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Dialogue is something that I struggle with a lot. Um, am I back? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, dialogue is something I struggle with a lot. And at the end, it comes down to personal choice and what you like. You have what you want to sacrifice, what you want to prioritize. Do you want to prioritize your audience enjoying the work, finding it really easy to just flip through, finding it really easy to relate to, or do you want to prioritize being super authentic as possible? Because I mean, your piece is going to be written in English for, well, it can be translated, but it's going to be written in like your language for audiences that speak your language, and then can be translated to others. But we're not going to make up new alien languages. You can have pieces of that in your text. I mean, Tolkien had pieces of Elvish, but you just have to choose what you want to go with. And I think people are really forgiving of that, especially if you add in phrases or idioms or euphemisms that seem really local to your world, and you can spend some time figuring out what those euphemisms or idioms might be. And that's just a nice little part of world building that can remind your audience, like, yeah, I'm writing this in English, but remember, like, they don't speak English, probably. Or at least not English the way we speak it now. Any other thoughts before we move on to the lecture? Alrighty. For today's lecture, we have another guest, Stacy Farina, and I will let her introduce herself.
I can't hear the audio.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for telling me. I will stop screen sharing and start again sharing the audio. Great.
Yeah, so physiology has more to...
No, that one.
So my name is Stacy Farina. I'm an assistant professor at Howard University, and I study evolution of form and function. So I'm interested in how animals have come to look the way that they look in terms of their anatomy and a little bit of physiology. And in particular, I'm interested in biomechanics. So I'm interested in how animals use the anatomy that they evolved to interact with the physics of their environment. And so I think about that not just in an ecological and a physiological sense, but also in an evolutionary sense. So I think a lot about how animals develop these relationships between their anatomical systems and their physical world.
Yeah, so Stacy does really cool work, mostly with fish. So a lot of her examples are going to be marine animals. But my first question when she told me what she did was, what is the difference between anatomy and physiology? Because she said she studies both of those, but I didn't realize they were different things.
Yeah, so physiology has more to do, I think, with molecules and reactions. So it's more about the chemistry of the body, and anatomy is more about the structures. And there can be a lot of overlap. So when you start to talk about the digestive system, you can talk about the anatomy of the stomach and all of the different layers of the digestive tract that have different functions from an anatomical perspective. But then you can also get into what those tissues are producing in terms of the enzymes that are used to break down different compounds and things like that. And so there's like, when you talk about musculoskeletal systems, you're talking about like lever arms and what it takes to run, jump, swim, eat, breathe. That is a lot more anatomy and biomechanics, because you're thinking about, you know, the shape of the structures and how that shape of the structures is designed to interact with the environment. But then when you start talking about things like digestion and reproduction and stuff like that, it gets more into physiology. But there's a lot of overlap. Like obviously every single system that we have in our bodies has an anatomical component and a physiological component. So chemistry is involved and anatomy is involved with every system.
Right, so unless you are trying to write a piece that is super technical and super detailed about everything, or maybe just the biology, you don't have to think about the specific difference between anatomy and physiology, which is why this lecture is just going to be about like biology as a whole. We're definitely not going to be able to cover everything, but hopefully we'll be able to give you a few tips and just like the surface ideas of biology and how evolution works. Are there any questions about this at all? I saw people shaking their heads. That is a good enough sign for me. Evolution happens at different scales, which is something that I didn't know. So I asked Stacy to tell me about that.
One of the basic things to know about evolution is that it really has a very simple definition, which is that it's any change in the genetic structure of a population, period, full stop. So any change at all is evolution. So thinking about changes over the course of really short time periods, especially thinking about natural selection and populations and things like that, the population level stuff is all microevolution. But there's this whole other field of evolutionary biology called macroevolution, where, and I consider myself a macroevolutionary biologist, where we study basically how diversity happens. So how we got to having millions of species on this planet. And so we think about common ancestry, we think about adaptations on long time scales. We think about these big changes, the difference between, a giraffe and a cockatoo, you know, those sorts of long-term, big-scale, how do we get all these weird, wacky animals? And there definitely are principles of microevolution that play into our understanding of macroevolution.
Yeah. So depending on the timescale of your story, depending on the timescale of your artistic creation, maybe you'll only be focused on microevolution. Maybe you'll only be focused on how a single population of a single species. So I'm in Manhattan right now. So maybe you'll only be focused on how humans living in Manhattan change over time because of their environment and because of different features or mechanisms of evolution that we'll get to in a second. Maybe you're only focused on that, but maybe within your story, you have people talking about species that existed millions of years ago, and that's getting into macroevolution. So you don't always have to think about both of them, but they're both ruled by the same basic principles. They're both driven by the same basic mechanisms. And one of those mechanisms is migration.
Migration is one mechanism of evolution. Just if you have a population of organisms and then you have a migrant come in from another population of the same species, now it's changed by just being a different individual. It's changed the genetic structure of a population, and therefore evolution has happened within the amount of time that it takes the organism to move from one place to another. So it can happen, you know, it doesn't have to be over generations. It doesn't have to even be technically over hours. But we tend to think about the changes that happen over longer periods of time because those are the changes that we tend to think of as more consequential. So if the genetic structure, like if you take a bus full of students and you drive them from DC to Arizona, you haven't changed the genetic structure of that group of students. But if if you introduce a new person onto the bus, now you've changed the structure of that population because now you have, like, every person has different genes. And
I'm back. Okay, all right. I guess that was all for migration. But essentially, there is a very small timescale part of evolution that's just introducing new genes to the pool. And the idea is that if you introduce a new person or new people to a population and they breed with the people who are already there, then they're adding new genes to future generations. And you can make this happen as slowly or as quickly as you want if you manipulate basically the gestation period of whatever your life form is. If people have babies really quickly, then migration and evolution, microevolution, happen really quickly. If, like elephants, you have babies really slowly, you have a long gestation period and there's a long time between subsequent generations, then microevolution from migration is going to happen pretty slowly. Does that make sense? Cool. Any questions about any of this?
I just think it's really interesting the way that she's talking about evolution as, like, I guess her definition of population is different than I expected. Because I was thinking of populations being like not dependent on where you are, but more about lineage, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So like the idea that importing people into a city would be evolution on its own just by them changing location. That's a new idea to me. That's interesting.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things that you'll probably get out of this lecture is the idea that a lot of biology is really fuzzy. Not all biologists even agree on the definition of life. Biologists don't all agree on what the definition of how you can distinguish different species. There's a lot of randomness involved in this. There's a lot of context dependence. So I think the biggest thing you can get out of this lecture is the idea that you have a lot more freedom in your evolutionary biology with your world building than you might think you have.
As a physicist working in biology, I can totally get behind that statement.
Great. Yeah, so let your imaginations run wild.
Migration.
The next mechanism for microevolution and macroevolution, this works there too, is mutation.
I think every time a human is born, they have 10 unique mutations, like on average, in their genome. Yeah.
That's so cool. Or
yeah,
horrible.
No, it's like awesome. What?
Is it bad? Like, not all mutations are bad, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the vast majority of mutations have no consequences whatsoever.
Mm.
So that's why we end up with a whole bunch of mutations, because like many of them have no effect on our biology whatsoever. And of course, there are mutations that do really bad things, and then less commonly mutations that might convey some sort of advantage. But for the most part, mutations are neutral. And so what it means is that every single human has a unique genome, which we know, but it can even, there are even differences from your parents. You know, you're inheriting what your parents have, but also you have your own genetic mutations that make you distinct from any aspect of their genome too.
I think that's the last one. Oh. So this here is a link probably to the Wikipedia article for genetic mutations. And actually, no, I don't think it's a Wikipedia article, but it goes into detail about the science of how mutations happen and how exactly they can change the DNA in different ways. It might also have some examples of specific mutations that have become more common in human populations. So you can read that if you want to know more about how mutations actually work. But any questions about mutations and how that affects evolution? One thing that Stacy didn't cover was that different species have different mutation rates. So you can also speed up or slow down your rate of evolution by changing the mutation rate. If you have very few genetic mutations every time someone is born, then evolution will happen more slowly. If every new person, if we 100x this, right? If every new person had 1,000 genetic mutations in their DNA, then our population as a species, and certainly within small isolated populations, like that would make evolution happen very rapidly compared to how it already happens.
And I guess that ends up being an element of macroevolution, that like changing it's like meta evolution, almost like it's changing the rate of evolution as an evolutionary process.
Right, yeah, it definitely feeds into macroevolution because you can have mutations that over many, many generations build up and become more prominent and actually split a species off from its like parent species branch.
Right.
All right, and then the next one is genetic drift, which I really love because it's essentially just randomness. So this is where the most opportunity for you to use your imagination comes into world building in terms of evolutionary biology.
Let's say you have a really small population, and this actually does occur very commonly on islands, and you have a mutation that in larger populations would just sort of exist. It wouldn't necessarily be rooted out, or it wouldn't necessarily take hold, but then in a small population, just by random chance, that gene, that new copy of that gene may become fixed in the population, in the population's genome, just due to the fact that there's just always a chance of a copy of a gene getting to a certain frequency that it becomes permanent in the population.
Okay.
And so that's why it's genetic drift. So, and one really cool example is there's an island in Micronesia where 10% of the population has complete color blindness. And complete color blindness is extremely rare. You almost never see it, but because I think they had a storm, several generations ago, and it wiped out, unfortunately, all but like 15 people. And one of those people happened to have this extremely rare condition. And that person, had reproductive success within the society, take that way you will. And so now a certain percentage of people that live on the island just have this color blindness because due to just the random chance of this gene taking hold in the population. So there's random forces, and it seems silly to say that a random force is a mechanism of evolution, but it does, especially with these tiny, tiny populations, it does actually really result in evolution.
That's really helpful from a world building perspective, because it means an author or a creator can make a random decision that will influence their population, and it's not totally unfounded in reality. That's nice.
Oh yeah.
I keep forgetting how many bullet points I have on each slide. But are there any questions about genetic drift and how it can influence populations over time?
I think there is still a constraint on how random the drift can be, as in how large of a change it can. So that's probably worth keeping in mind. I think it can't be something too random, I guess.
Right, yeah. It has to be something that's already possible given the current genome. For example, humans don't have a type of cell in our body that can turn our skin blue. So you're not going to have genetic drift that over time makes humans look blue because we just don't have that in our genome right now. So it has to be something that's rooted in what's already possible. But once you decide what different genes influence, like there are genes for skin color, there are genes for hair type, there are genes for height, things like that, or that are related to these different things. Once you decide what your genome can influence, that tells you what your realm of possibility for genetic drift is.
Let's say.
And then the fourth mechanism for evolution is the one that most people are most familiar with, natural selection or adaptation.
So if we're talking about natural selection, which is like when the environment is imposing some sort of selective pressure onto the organisms, there are three major things that you need. So first, you need to have variation in a population. Mm-hmm. So if everybody in the population has the same genetics and also the same anatomy, the same traits, then there's nothing for natural selection to do with that. So there has to be variation in the population.
There is always going to be genetic variation in a population unless you're dealing with clones, but that you can make that decision.
And number two is that variation has to be heritable. So those traits that we talk about that vary have to be able to be passed from one generation to the next.
Mm-hmm. What are some things that aren't heritable?
That's a good question, because most of the traits that we think about at least have some genetic component. And so heritable just means that at least some aspect of it can be passed down. And so height is an example of kind of a complicated one, because height has to do with your parents' height. So it is heritable. But it also has to do with your environmental factors. So it has to do with like what you ate, the kinds of exercise that you did and things like that. So there's a strong genetic component, but there's also an environmental component. And a lot of traits are like that, where it's not just an on and off thing. But as long as there's some sort of genetic component to it, natural selection can act on it. But anything that you acquire in life, so for example, like if you get really good at knitting, you're not going to be able to pass that on to the next generation unless you teach your offspring how to knit.
I don't know. I feel like my mom definitely passed on all of her knowledge of 80s music to me in the womb.
So those traits have to be variable and they have to be heritable. And they also have to have some influence on your ability to survive and reproduce. So your knowledge of 80s music, if it were heritable, may or may not affect your ability to survive and reproduce. But your ability to gather food and your ability to run fast, those are all things that in different environments might allow some individuals in the population to be more likely to survive than others.
So this last point is really interesting to me because it shows, it implies what the purpose of life and evolution on Earth are. The fact that genetic traits need to affect your ability to survive and reproduce imply that we're here to reproduce and create more of us. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can imagine a world where the prime directive is not to reproduce and grow the population, especially if it's a super long-lived life form, for example. And that would change these requirements for natural selection and adaptation to happen, because a genetic trait wouldn't have to affect your ability to reproduce to change the path of evolution. Does that make sense?
So you're saying if a species individuals are very long-lived, then what would happen?
Oh, so that was just like a throwaway example, but it was to make a point that this is how our evolution pathways work, because the point of humans from an evolutionary perspective is to make more humans. But you can imagine scenarios where that's not the case, where a species isn't around just to propagate that species and make more of them, especially if it's something that's maybe created by something else and they have a different function other than just surviving and reproducing. Yeah. And a long-lived species was the example off the top of my head for why you might not super care about propagating future generations. Any questions about this? So these four mechanisms, migration, mutation, genetic drift, and natural selection, are all drivers of both micro and macro evolution on different scales, on different time scales. And so you can use those depending on what you want to incorporate into your story.
I wanted to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to comment on something. So actually, I work with this animal called C. elegans. It's a little worm. I don't know if you've heard about it. So it's a clone. It's it's a hermaphrodite, both male and female, and it usually makes genetically identical copies of itself. But it still manages to do quite a lot of adapt, etc., despite being a clone. And so it has all of these. For example, genetic drift is an important component. Environmental pressures release some interesting adaptations that allow it to make more variation in the gene pool. And one of the things that happen is actually that when the environment is difficult, more challenging, for example, if you increase the temperature or reduce the food, then suddenly males appear. So there is a very tiny chance of males appearing in a population. And the entire purpose of the male is to cross and introduce genetic variation.
Yeah,
fascinating.
That is interesting. But it's also like very, very specific.
Yeah.
To C. elegans. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
definitely one
other things too.
Yeah.
But what I meant to say was that's not a general rule of thumb.
No. I think it's not. But yeah, it's just an example of how even when you have clones, biology finds a way to introduce. So this idea of introducing variation is the key idea, I think. And even if you restrict yourself, let's say in your world that you have a world of clones, you can still find a way, like C. elegans does, or some other way to introduce variation.
Yeah, I have slides later about reproduction and the different pathways for that. So, for sure. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? All right, now on to things that are specifically about macroevolution, like how species work.
So you have a speciation, which is just like one species splits into two, but then irradiation would be like, okay, so you start with one species and then you do a bunch of splits and then you have a whole bunch of species that you didn't have before. So some groups go through that process more quickly than others. We like to think about sort of prehistoric looking or primitive looking organisms that basically have stayed unchanged. So sharks are a great example, and sharks are relatively diverse. Like I said, like it's an older group than the ray finned fishes. So there's the ray finned fishes that have like 34,000 species of fish. So everything that you think of typically as a bony fish falls in that group. But then sharks, there are only about 1,000 of them, 1,000 species of elasmobranchs. And then sharks themselves, I think it's like 700 or 500. And they look, most sharks look very similar to what you would find in the fossil records. But then you have things like seahorses and deep sea anglerfish. Like you have like, you know, like it's very clear looking at the evolutionary history of a seahorse that it hasn't really been around for very long. So there are some groups that seem to change really quickly and some groups that seem to maintain their traits for long periods of time, you know, millions and millions of years. So that's kind of a cool story thing because, you know, you can imagine like a creature in the deep that's basically been unchanged for millions of years.
Yeah.
Sort of cool to think about. Because we don't actually know why some species spend long periods of time unchanged and some change. Because like you can have, you know, animals like in the same environment and like one group of animals will stay unchanged and the other group of animals in the exact same environment will diversify and speciate and radiate.
Yeah, so that has to do with things like how many mutations are there per new generation. How extreme is the environment, like Tassif was saying with C. elegans. If you have environments with different conditions, then that will lead through genetic drift and adaptation that will lead to different pathways, and it'll affect species differently, even if they're in the same environment. So there is no one right way to do this. So you have a lot of freedom if you want to create different species on your planet, especially if you want to create a story that has more than one dominant species. I feel like those stories aren't as common as I would like them to be. And there are definitely realistic pathways to make that happen. Any question about speciation? All right, well, it's 2:00. Let's take 5 minutes. And when we get back, we're going to talk about big driving forces of macroevolution. All right, let's start making our way back. I feel like I don't see enough animals on these calls. I know you have pets.
My cat was just harassing me, as he always does when I'm in a meeting.
What's your cat's name?
Liam.
Liam. Cosmo's sleeping on the couch next to me, being a cute little nuisance. All right, so let's start talking about big driving events of macroevolution that can just change the course of a species or many species dramatically in a short period of time. Not necessarily short.
So natural selection can be sort of ticking along and sort of fine-tuning things, but then you get these sort of big moments of change, and it could be associated with a mass extinction, like, you know, the asteroid killing a bunch of dinosaurs. And that really radically changed the trajectory of mammals, because now mammals have all of this environment to be able to inhabit without the threat of these predators that were once sort of keeping their diversity at bay. But then there's also innovation that sort of comes across over longer periods of time. So one of the examples of that is the evolution of pharyngeal jaws, which are jaws in the pharynx of fish. So you've got the oral jaws, which are out at front, and the things you normally think of as jaws. But then you have jaws in the back of the throat, and what they actually are modified gill arches. So they've lost their respiratory function, and instead they can be used for things like chewing and grinding prey.
So they can just like chew all the way down their throats?
Yeah, or in the back of the throat, like they'll have like a second set of jaws, almost like Alien. So teeth are really cool because like we associate teeth with the jaw, but like teeth can kind of go wherever they want. They usually stay in the jaw, but like, you know, teeth are basically, they evolved from scales, and scales can be everywhere. And so teeth can kind of migrate around. And so some of the teeth might have migrated to the back of the throat, and that might have caused an advantage for some of the species. But then, like, let's say that they, instead of, you know, incisor or pointy leg teeth, let's say that some of them had molars, and then all of a sudden they have molars in the back of their throat that they can now use to grind stuff. And then slowly over time, those molars become like really crazy molars. Like you can see like some fish have like crazy molars in the back of their throat for crushing things. But that happened sort of over a long period of time, but it's still innovation. And then once the pharyngeal jaws really took hold, then you see this massive radiation, because now these fish that maybe could only eat like other fish before, now they can eat, they can grind up plant material, they can eat snails, they can crush snails, they can crush hard prey, they can crush crustaceans and things like that. So you go from having fish that are pretty limited in what their mouth can do, and now all of a sudden they have this ability to process prey in a way they didn't before.
Right, so mass extinction, like the dinosaurs, I think we've had, 5 or 6 mass extinctions here on Earth that can affect a lot of different things. One of the examples she used, mammals coming out after the dinosaurs went extinct, happened because the absence of species A can lead to either a rise or a decline in species B. One example that comes to mind is wolves at Yellowstone. So when wolves were either taken out of Yellowstone intentionally, or their population got really low in Yellowstone for some reason, I don't remember which, the population of deer and like moose and other things that wolves prey on, they rose dramatically. The population of deer actually got so high that they started overgrazing the land in Yellowstone. And so Yellowstone had a lot more rock or landslides because there weren't enough trees to keep the land in the right place. The course of rivers changed over time. And then because there were too many deer, they had too much competition for food. There wasn't enough food available for them, so then their population started to decline. So different ecological systems are in really delicate equilibrium, and if you remove or add different species that prey on or are preyed on by other species, then that will affect the balance. So keep that in the back of your mind. And mass extinction is like a really dramatic, a really extreme version of taking out a species. Innovation can happen because of genetic drift or natural selection, but it's a cool sub component of those things where by random chance or because of adaptation, a species gets a new trait that gives them some advantage, like the pharyngeal jaws, or like apes learning to walk upright. That advantage gives them that advantage makes it easier for those species to propagate. And once one group of a species learns how to do something new, then that new ability lets them branch out into different activities, and that leads to more speciation. So that's innovation. There's another one that I don't think we talked about that's similar to mass extinction in that it depends on the environment. But I think we talked about it a little bit last week in the geology section. So for example, the Great Oxygenation Event, when the atmosphere got a lot more oxygen in it, that led to different animals developing the ability to breathe oxygen, which helped them move faster and have more energy somehow. I'm not totally sure how that works, but different environmental events, like a new atmospheric composition, can also lead to high rates of speciation, because these new species now have a new pathway to generate energy, or whatever else. The generating energy thing is specific to the Great Oxygenation Event. Any questions about this? There are a lot more than just mass extinction, innovation, and atmospheric changes. But I after this class, I can look for an online resource for that. Any questions? What does it say? Species, your faces are covering the titles of the slides. Species differentiation. Yes. So I said before that biologists don't agree on how you can differentiate species. There are apparently a lot of different ways that you can do it. And you have to change your method of differentiation to match the characteristics of a group of species. So Stacy has some interesting things to say about that.
What makes something a different species?
What those sort of theories are called are like species concepts. And so the reproduction one is the biological species concept. So the classic definition is two groups that can no longer interbreed. And not just interbreed as in produce an offspring, but then that offspring has to be fertile and be able to produce other offspring.
Okay.
But hybridization happens, and this is another kind of cool evolutionary thing that could get worked into a story. Hybrids happen all the time, and fertile hybrids happen too. And they can be completely different species. And it happens in fish quite often that you'll have like a bluegill sunfish and a pumpkin seed sunfish, which are distinct species. Like you can find genetic differences between them that are very, very well solidified in the population, but you can bring them together and they can make fertile offspring. Just like normal. And even things sometimes that are really different from each other. I think one of the big ones recently they found is that sturgeons and paddlefish, which are closely related. Like sturgeons are like these big, like armored, ancient looking fish. That's another example of a group that's spent a long time unchanged. And then paddlefish are the closest relatives of sturgeons, but they probably split about, I think the estimate is like at least 100 million years ago. And so they've been split for a long time, and there are lots of paddlefish and there are lots of sturgeons, but then they found that one species of paddlefish was able to interbreed with this one species of sturgeon, and the offspring looked totally wonky. It's like paddlefish have this big paddle-like nose, and so now you have these armored fish with the paddle-like nose. Crazy.
And so is that hybrid now considered a new species of its own?
No, and actually now that I think about it, I'm not sure that they've proven it's fertile.
Okay.
But no, because I don't think hybrids are generally never considered to be their own species. I'm trying to think of an example where that wouldn't be true, but the hybrids just sort of exist in nature. They're sort of in this weird in-between spot of, belonging to one species or another. They just sort of exist. And if you were to separate the two species, the hybrids would go away. So there's usually like a hybrid zone where the two species are interacting with each other. And if that hybrid zone were to go away for some reason, the hybrids would too.
I am just imagining a really messed up world where two different species realize that they can interbreed and create hybrids that aren't fertile, and they just like keep creating them for free labor, and it's horrible. But I can just okay, cool.
That's really dark.
Yeah. Sometimes world building gets really dark.
Yeah. But there are other species concepts, and so there's like, and I don't know their technical terms, but there's like the genetic species concept, which is, you say, okay, we're going to define these species as species if they're different enough in their genomes that we are, and it's a little bit arbitrary because like, I don't like that number is going to be different for different groups of organisms. And then there's also like the phylogenetic species concept, which is to say, okay, if we have a common ancestor and then it splits off into two and we can follow that split in the genome, then we're going to call it a different species. But I think like one of the reasons that you can't have one united species concept is because every group is a little bit different. So some groups hybridize really well, so you can't use the biological species concept.
Right. So depending on what the characteristics of your group of species is, you have to differentiate them differently. And this gets us into how genes are transferred and how reproduction happens in different species, which is actually really interesting. And I went down a deep internet rabbit hole when I was doing this research. But are there any questions about species concepts and how you might want to use that in your world building?
I think it's like a good example of how all of our scientific models are just models, and they're always imperfect. And kind of it makes me think of like models of gender as well. Like, there's just like life never fits into our preconceptions, and that's always a fertile bed for storytelling as well, I guess.
Yeah, love that. Any other thoughts? Cool.
Some groups don't have sexual reproduction at all, so you can't use the biological species concept, like bacteria and stuff. Not only do they not sexually reproduce, and so it's really hard to follow different lineages, but also they have horizontal gene transfer, where which means instead of vertical, so like one generation to the next, it's horizontal, which means one individual to another. So bacteria, through bacteriophages, like little viruses that transmit like bacterial genomic information, like they can, like a part of the genome of one bacteria can get literally spliced into another bacteria. When you think about bacteria, it's more useful to think about like, different like a colony of bacteria over here, and some of that genetic, like as some cells die or as they get as like a phage comes along and takes the genetic material, like some of those cells might die. The original like colony will still be intact, so that species will still exist. But then if that genetic material makes its way over to this other bacterial colony and gets inserted into that genome, then those genes are going to take hold in that bacterial strain. And so everybody's still sort of around, but it's just more like genes get transferred between, different sort of pockets of bacteria.
Are they like slingshotting their genetic material over? Do they just like run at each other really fast and merge? Like how?
There's a certain amount of genetic material from bacteria just in the environment. Bacteria and viruses. So viral DNA or viral RNA can get spliced into the genome of a bacteria. There's a reason why it's really easy to contaminate a DNA sample. Like you talk about, like, you hear in forensics, like, oh, the sample got contaminated. It's because like, if you aren't really careful to sterilize everything, there's just an ambient amount of genetic material just like kicking around from when cells die. Like, and so if some other bacteria end up picking that up into their genome. It's more of a random process.
So there are different types of gene transfer. You can have horizontal and vertical, and we didn't talk a lot about vertical gene transfer specifically, but I, after doing my own research after this conversation, mapped this onto reproduction. So Tassif was talking earlier about genetic diversity and how you need to introduce variation into different gene pools, especially when you're talking about clones. And that's because if you have a species that doesn't reproduce sexually, if they use asexual reproduction, then you need to have other ways besides, different genomes coming together and mixing to promote genetic diversity. And I think this link actually is the Wikipedia article for asexual reproduction. If you have vertical gene transfer, then that means you have parents essentially passing their genetic material onto their offspring through sexual reproduction. And that gets into issues of how you can fertilize eggs. This gets into issues of how families are constructed, how genders are constructed. We have, broadly speaking, if you're thinking in a binary, there are two sexes, and for a long time, people have thought that there are also two genders that map directly onto those sexes. But if you have a species that reproduces differently, or they have multiple sexes, they have multiple types of gametes, then family norms are going to be different, gender norms are going to be different. Within vertical gene transfer, think about how fertilization happens. We fertilize our eggs internally. Most mammals fertilize internally, but you can also have external fertilization, where someone lays eggs and then those eggs are fertilized and hatch later. In the science fiction novel I wrote in college, the species was informed by a lot of marine biology, so they were hermaphroditic. And they had a mating season where people would decide if they wanted to lay eggs, and then there was a central spot in the colony where people would go to lay their eggs, and if another person wanted to fertilize those eggs, they could do that. And so they would go to the central spot and fertilize the eggs, and then later on those eggs would hatch. And because no one knew which offspring came from which egg layer and which fertilizer, everyone just decided to rear the offspring themselves. It was more of a village type of family unit where there weren't moms, there weren't dads, everyone just took care of all of the youngins. And so depending on how people transfer genes, depending on how fertilization happens, that will think about how that works and then use that to inform gender norms, if there are gender norms, and the family unit. Any questions about that? Cool. Stacy studies biomechanics, which is really cool, and she gave some tips for how you can think about biomechanics when you're designing your own creature.
I mean, biomechanics as a field is really fascinating. Like, there are some basic principles. Like, I can give you some like general toolkits. So for example,
but first I should tell you that biomechanics is the field that is devoted to figuring out how different biological parts move and function, and how they work with their environment.
You tend to see long limbs in things that move really quickly, and it has to do with levers. So you tend to see long limbs in things that move really quickly, but then you see short limbs in things that need to be really powerful. And the reason is because if you have a long out lever to a short in lever, that is going to increase speed. And one of when I explain this to my students, I usually have a paddle with me, because you can see, like, like competitive rowers have extremely long oars. And the reason is because it gives them a long out lever, and then they have a small in lever that they're pulling on. And so basically the same motion of moving their hands just a few inches gives a much wider arc for the same amount of time. And so increasing distance in the same amount of times, it increases your speed. So you've got, increased distance per second. So long out lever, short in lever gives you speed.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you want something to be really strong, you need the complete opposite. You need a long out lever and you need a long in lever and a short out lever, or a shorter out lever. So for example, like the crowbar is the example that I use in class. Like I have a crowbar that I pull out and I actually use it to break something. Like the out lever, the in lever of a crowbar is like the whole long arm. So you've got this long arm that's basically amplifying the amount of force that you're able to exert with this tiny little out lever that's at the end of your crowbar. And so you can amplify your own force. And so it's the same thing if you have like big hip muscles that are attaching to like half the leg and then like a tiny little, limb at the end of it. So you've got like a short out lever, but a really long in lever. Then you've got a really powerful, strong system.
Got it. Like an alligator or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
But you can also, one of the great examples is jaws. So jaws can be really strong. So like long and skinny jaws, like you see long and skinny jaws in things that eat fish, like that have to be fast. So you see in an alligator jaw, or there are like these alligator crocodilians with like really long jaws called gharials, and like they just like want to snap really quickly. But if you see like short and stubby jaws, like in a shark, their jaw muscles like insert about like halfway to the front of the jaw, so that they have like a really long in lever and a shorter out lever, so that they can really crush things. So powerful jaws are not going to be long and skinny. They're going to be short and stubby with the muscles inserting as far forward as they can get. There's also like drag. So things that live in the water are going to tend to be torpedo shaped, because if they're not, they're going to create a lot of pressure drag. So they're going to have a big wake behind them. One of the cool things, so like animals, when they transitioned from being like, so when fish came out onto land, tetrapods, so land-dwelling animals, evolved a neck. So fish actually don't have any neck skeleton. They don't have any cervical vertebrae. They just have, basically, fish shoulders are attached to their skull.
Okay.
But when they went out of water, now all of a sudden you've got these land-dwelling animals that need to be able to look around, and they don't have to deal with drag. So one of the reasons to not have a neck is because it sort of messes with your torpedo shape if you start moving your head around. But then necks evolved. And then millions and millions of years later, you had things like marine mammals, so things like whales going back into the water. And so whales actually do have cervical vertebrae, but they've been like compressed really, really tiny. So like a whale, like you can have a huge whale and the cervical vertebrae will be like all like compressed into this one little area. So they still have the neck skeleton, but when you look at them externally, they're torpedo shaped.
Stacy gave one recommendation for books. I think this is the link up here at the top, the biomechanics link. There's a professor of biomechanics who recently died, but he wrote a popular book about biomechanics that just gives a bunch of these types of examples for how you can manipulate a biological structure to get the desired effect. Another really common one that people talk about is eye placement. If you have eyes in the front of your head, it means you're a predator, and if you have eyes on the side of your head, it means you're prey. That's not super true. It's not always true. There are counter examples like hippos who have eyes on the sides of their heads, but they are vicious and they could chomp your head off without even trying. So that rule of thumb isn't always true, but it is a good heuristic to use. And so this book by Stephen Fogel, if you want to get it to help you in your biomechanics, is probably pretty helpful. I read some of his stuff and it's actually pretty straightforward and easy to understand.
Biomechanics.
And then we have some miscellaneous other thoughts from Stacy.
You can pretty much have any sort of biological scenario. Like, I don't think that there are limits, and this might be sort of controversial, and certainly there are like physiological limits. So, for example, elephants couldn't be as big as they were if they had a ton of hair. So one of the reasons that elephants don't have hair is because they are so large that their surface area to volume ratio is such that they are constantly overheating. So like a little tiny organism is going to have a small volume relative to a high amount of surface area on the body, but as you get bigger, you increase in volume by a factor of 3, but you only increase in surface area by a factor of 2.
Right.
And so therefore, like, you have a lot more, like, your body mass is what produces the heat. And so if you get to a certain size, you have a tendency to overheat your body. That's why elephants have to, have like skin with no hair, and they have to have all these folds for extra surface area, and they have to have these big ears for extra surface area.
All right, so there are trade-offs. If you wanna like do really well or like go really far in one area, you have to kind of sacrifice something else.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about things that we would probably consider magical powers, like reading minds, or like we consider flying a magical power, but there are birds who fly. So like, is there anything that truly biology couldn't make happen?
Well, I think the main limitation is what's in your genome and what your ancestors look like. And so from that perspective, I would say no, because, like I said, hopeful monsters, right? You could have a telepathic creature, that all of a sudden has whatever gene, like if there's a possibility of the genome being able to do it at this current point in time, then there's always a chance that anything could evolve.
Mm. All right. All I'm hearing from you is that X-Men is totally possible.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Maybe
dope.
not with this current set of not with this current genome, maybe not, but 100,000 years, it's a different genome, it's a different game. Who knows? I think it's mostly a developmental issue. And you've got these flatfish, right, that have, like, they're the perfect example of asymmetry, but they actually hatch as symmetrical embryos. So when they hatch from their eggs, they're symmetrical for about 30 days. And then the eye migration takes place when they're really super, super tiny.
What?
Yeah. Yep.
Like the eye moves?
Yes. Mm-hmm. During development, yeah. Yeah, so I think the main reason
we were talking about flatfish because they are a weird animal that has 2 eyes on one side of their head, and I wanted to show that video of the eye like literally migrating from one side of the head over to the other, which is a video that Stacy made when she was a grad student as a project.
For symmetry is that it's easier to genetically create 2 halves that are more or less identical than it is to you'd have to be more developmentally complicated to make one half look one way and the other half look another way. And there's different types of symmetry. So there's bilateral symmetry, which is the one that we're talking about, the one we most commonly think about. But there's also radial symmetry, where you have like jellyfish and sea stars and things like that, like sort of radiate from a central point.
Yeah, so those were all of the just random things that Stacy and I talked about. But I think the biggest point here is biology can do anything as long as you construct a genome that makes it possible. So if you want to have telepaths, if you want to have people who, breathing underwater is a bad example because there are fish, but if you like whatever you want to make happen for your story, if you know when you're planning your story that you want the people to be able to do a certain thing, you can make it happen, and it's not unreasonable from a biological standpoint. And if you end up publishing this piece of art and people complain, they're like, it's not realistic, people can't read minds, you can just point them back to Stacy. and say, this PhD having biology professor said it's possible, so don't argue with me. All right, I'm gonna skip over this part so we can talk about our world so far, but think about these questions in your own time. How humanoid do you want your life forms to be? We talked about this earlier when we were discussing the reading and the video, but as more humanoid characters means it's going to be easier for your audience to relate to them. Both you and your audience are going to have to do less work to create the story and then become immersed in the story, respectively. Think about what your life forms need to survive once you create their biology, because that will determine a lot of parts of their culture. How often do they need to eat? How often do they reproduce? How often do they sleep? What temperature ranges are they comfortable in? That will determine if they like have hair, or if they need clothes, or if they need shelter, things like that. Think about how they're going to adapt to new environments. If you have people migrating from one part of your world to another, then you'll have to show that they are adapting to those new environments, or maybe they're really struggling. Especially if you have like international relations, if you have people from a very warm, temperate climate going and visiting people who live near the poles, if it has a tilt or obliquity similar to Earth. But if you have people from a temperate climate going and interacting with people from a very cold climate, maybe that will influence the decisions that are made at that like international meeting. So keep those things in mind. For next time, here is the reading. I want you to add some biological traits on top of the worlds that you've already built. But now I really want to start thinking about your worlds. So at this point, you should have thought about the stellar system for your world and the geological history of your world and the climate history of your world. So let's start talking about that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it's not useful anymore, and I can just see you. Would anyone like to talk about their world?
I'll start. Even though I just got back, I missed the last 60 minutes of,
That's
of
okay.
class. Hopefully that'll be the last meeting that interrupts, knock on wood. So I haven't like fleshed out all the numbers, everything yet to like make sure it makes sense. But and I mean, this might be kind of like corny because it just kind of pulls from my job where I learn about orbits and stuff. So I thought, oh, like what if you put a planet like, or like a satellite, like a natural satellite at one of these unique orbits. So I have two ideas. One that I've started moving down, which is like if you were to have a moon at a geosynchronous orbit, which, and you know, geosynchronous is going to depend on the orbital rates of the central planet. So I'm playing around with what I need to do with the central planet to make that reasonable, where something that's like big enough to also have life on it could be a natural satellite at that distance. And the idea is, the same type of life in general, or like life came from the same place on both of those bodies. But obviously, one of them is going to be a much smaller body, and it's going to, have different spin rates and stuff like that. So, there will be different, different features to the people, the humanoid creatures that live on both planets. And the geological aspect of it is that, so with the geosynchronous orbit, you're hovering above the same, longitude, no matter at all times. So what I'm imagining is imagine Earth without like the Americas. So just the Pacific Ocean is way bigger. And imagine if right above that huge ocean is where that geosynchronous planet is. So the people on the central body, they don't know that other planet exists.
Ooh.
Or that moon exists. But so what I still need to do is like when I figure out the makeup, like look at the angles and see, because I can imagine maybe like at sunrise and sunset, you see this bright thing in the sky just because of, the way that it, the way that works. But, I haven't figured out the geometry yet. But maybe there could be like seafaring people who venture out into the ocean and they see this bright star and they're like, oh, what's that? And so I have no idea what I'm going to do with that story, but that's kind of the world that I'm trying to build.
I really like that. Does anyone have thoughts or suggestions or comments?
I was actually just going to put in chat, there's a really good short story you should read by someone named Mary Robinette Kowal called A Fire Upon the Heavens. And it's about a bunch of people who live under a tidally locked moon. So they've never seen the sun and they go sailing. And when it turns to daylight, all hell breaks loose with a new group of people who don't know that the moon exists or that dark is a thing. And the cultures don't get along as well as you would hope. But it's a really interesting short story and a really cool thing of world building. I love unique stuff like that. That sounds really cool.
You said it's called A Fire Upon the Heavens?
You'll have to double check, but yes.
Okay, cool, thanks.
See if I can find a link to it and put it in the Discord.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. Any other thoughts or questions? Have you thought about tides at all? Will this moon affect tides, and if so, how?
I don't think it will, because I think it's going to have to be really far away, unless I unless I do something real drastic with the spin rate, with the duration of a day on the central planet. I think that planet will have to be pretty far away. So I don't think it'll impact that. But I also need to think about, just this giant, almost global ocean, sort of what the impacts of that will be. I haven't thought much about, the land side, like what that looks like, if it's just a big Pangea or if it's, something that looks like, Eurasia and Africa, where it's kind of split up, but it is just kind of one big. So yeah, I haven't done as much development as I would want, but
cool.
That is a good question.
It's in a great spot. We'll talk more about this in the religion and myth aspect, but I feel like there's probably going to be, once they do discover the moon, if that's going to be like the central conflict of your story, that will do some really cool myth things. I'm excited to see what you make with that when we get to that point in the class.
Yeah, I kind of thought about some sort of like dual space race thing where like the people on the moon are trying to get to the Earth, and I don't know, maybe, I haven't figured out how. Maybe it's just that, and they think that they're going to this completely aquatic world, this ocean world, and then they, wash up on some shore, and what that looks like. But yeah, no, that's a good point. I think there's a lot of stuff I could do with that.
Nice. Do you have any idea yet how similar you want the life forms to be on the moon versus the planet?
I mean, I could imagine their lives looking really different because of I was really thinking about the duration of the day and what that means for just the pace of life and all that. I didn't imagine them being super different.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was thinking, like Earth and Mars, because Mars is much smaller than the Earth, and I imagine that my moon is going to be about the size of Mars, maybe a little bit smaller. It might have to be a little smaller to make sense. But similar atmosphere, similar makeup of the planet, where the life forms aren't too different based on their kind of where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
love it. Yeah. When we talk about this next time, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about what the biology of the different species will be. Cool. Thanks so much, Philip. I love this. I can't wait to see it.
Thanks.
Anyone else want to talk about their world?
I guess
Or
I can go.
okay.
So I was thinking about a world that started within the habitable zone of its host star. And so it was developing life, and the main species would have been a marine creature that began to diverge into, you know, subspecies of marine and the subspecies of creatures that are beginning to come up on land when a hot Jupiter in the system migrated out and destabilized its orbit. And so if it had any moons, it probably lost it in the process, and the Jupiter may have lost some moons, but the planet ended up being captured by the Jupiter as it migrated out. And so the planet becomes trapped in this non-habitable zone around the Jupiter. And the gravitational interactions between the planet and its, I guess, now the moon and its host planet keeps the volcanic activity happening. So some creatures on this planet would have been able to survive, even though now it's far out of the habitable zone and it's very icy. And if they live around like the volcanic regions and hot springs. And so the whole idea is that now the apex species that has started to diverge becomes completely separated by a thick ice sheet over the ocean. And so there's a completely land-dwelling subspecies and a completely ocean subspecies, and there's no interaction between the two, but they kind of exist within each other's mythology as maybe monsters or angels or creatures, even though they're from the same ancestor, you know.
Oh, that's so cool. Are you thinking of putting this in terms of a story, like a written piece?
Maybe.
Okay. Yeah,
Haven't gotten that far.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I'm asking because I'm wondering, like, when in this whole, this planet's going to last for billions of years. I'm trying to figure out when in that time scale your piece would be set.
Right. So it would. Yeah, I don't know. So I think the creatures are going to be the two species are going to be pretty far evolved from each other if there was a story by the time they do. Mm-hmm. But I'm kind of thinking about how ways to get the ocean dwellers to interact with the land dwellers, I guess. And because the ocean dwellers would have been pushed, I think, deeper into the ocean to be near the vents. But yeah, my thought is the ocean dwellers probably would have, they might have had some kind of primitive sight, from before, but that kind of become like a vestigial thing, and most of them lose their ability to see, but maybe some are still born with a more advanced type of sight, and these people would be better able to go higher up into the ocean where there's more light, and maybe some way you can get some interactions between the two species then, and that's where the story would happen.
Awesome. Is there anything you, at this point, I know we still have more classes, but is there anything at this point you feel like you still need to figure out that maybe the other students or I can help you with?
I think the geology of the entire planet is the most confusing to me, because it's all of the water is going to be like a thick ice sheet on top of the ocean, and so I suppose through you might get cracks in the ocean, I'm guessing, through the tectonic plate shifting, but I don't know how long that would take to freeze back over, or how exposed the ocean would become in those instances, and how the tectonics work when it's a completely icy kind of world. Well, there's ice and then there's land, but most of it's the ice ocean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my first thought is to be careful about what the ratio of land to ocean is, because if the ocean is totally icy, it's going to be reflecting a lot of light and heat back from, well, I guess it's so far away from its star. So I guess albedo doesn't super matter here. There are moons in the solar system that have these thick icy sheets that have almost like tectonic plate movement in the ice sheets, that's driven by differences in salinity. So there are different amounts of salts in different parts of the ice, and that drives movement. So you can get cracks that way.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah.
Does anyone else have thoughts or questions?
So that sounds like a really cool situation, or maybe a bad situation for those species. I don't know. Now that the planet is orbiting, you said like a hot Jupiter, so it's like providing some heat, but it's not enough to support life. So was it that the geothermal activity is that what is kind of keeping the system going?
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool.
So what resources do they have a lot of?
They'd have a lot of stone and things like that. So they're going to be, at least the people on the land would be living around the volcano, so they'll have stone. I don't think there's going to be a lot of plant life, but I'm thinking there might have evolved some plant-like life that they can learn to, live in harmony with. That would help. But I'm still thinking about how not having plants would completely affect the technologies and things that they develop.
Yeah. Do you want to share your early thoughts on that? Or do you want to bake it a little longer?
Well, right now, the main plant-like life I'm thinking of is like a coral-type creature that lives, it's kind of like a bridge between the earth and the water. So it develops on the land, but it can burrow down through the ice into the water. And so it kind of regulates the oxygen between the two environments. And
that's so cool.
I think I would also like some non-plant creatures that can photosynthesize a little bit, and maybe they get that ability through eating this coral-like plant.
I really like that. That's super cool.
Thank you.
What do you think the next step is for you?
I need to think more about the actual anatomy of both of the creatures, both of the species. And after I get that, maybe I'd go more into the cultures of them. I think the mythology of the creatures will be a strong point. If this was a story, that'd be like the base is how their different religions grew out of their different environments and what role they play in each other's religious system.
Mm-hmm. So kind of like Weep for Day, where they have these two drastically different environments and a religion rises out of that. That's really awesome.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to it. We have a few more minutes. Does anyone else want to talk about their world? Or even just your motivation for your world. Remember back in the first class, we talked a bit about how there are different ways that you can choose what makes your world different from our own. If you want to share that decision, then that'd be great.
I'll go. So the planet in mind is assumed to be a rogue planet by the people going to study it. And when they arrive, they find that it's not the case. It's that their sun is occluded by a Dyson swarm. And so when they land, they discover that the people that used to live there were a Type 2 civilization who were migrating their entire solar system. And the watery world that they land on, the innards of which is the mechanics that run the whole thing, and they use the planet as not just like an ecosystem aquarium for everything they're taking with them, but as coolant for the whole system to run. Push basically the solar system like a stellar engine.
So they're trying to move their entire system through the galaxy?
Yeah.
Nice. Where do they live? Like the main people?
I haven't decided if they make an appearance or if they've, failed somehow and never and don't actually end up showing up or not.
Okay.
I'm debating whether or not they're still there when people arrive.
Got it. And who are the people arriving? Is it humans?
Humans
Nice.
who are nowhere near this level of technological advancement.
Okay.
You know,
But they still have to be pretty advanced.
Babies in space exploration.
I love that. What gave you the idea of moving an entire solar system?
Do you know the YouTube channel Kurzgesagt?
Yeah.
So I had just refinished playing this game, Subnautica, which is a phenomenal survival game / it's almost a horror game disguised as a survival game about you crash landing on an alien planet, and there's a 4-bearer race and all sorts of cool stuff. Phenomenal game. But I also watched their video on the Kardashev scale on what types of different civilizations and what life might look like and how you might find it if you don't know what you're looking for. And that was just really, really cool to me. And I've read stuff like Larry Niffin's Ringworld, and there actually is a species in that is moving their entire species away from the galactic core as fast as they can. I just thought that was really, really cool advanced technology.
Absolutely. Oh, that's awesome. So what do you still need to think about?
So the person going to explore the planet was going to crash land there because of incompatibilities in technology. So I need to figure out how she survives on this world, what kind of, food might be there, how you explore something that's mostly a watery planet with few bits of land in between. It's been fun to work on.
Nice. What type of technology did the people leave behind, the other species?
So at first, they're not going to find anything. They're going to think it's somewhat of an abandoned world, and then they're going to stumble upon, some of the ruins of it. So I don't know that how much of the technology is going to be things that they'll be able to make use of and learn from, or if it's just going to be basically magic to them.
Okay. Sounds awesome. Any thoughts or comments or questions for Andy?
That sounds really cool. And I think it's always really fun having stories about like the mystery of like what happened to this advanced species. So I think there's a lot of potential for fun there.
Absolutely. So next week, I would love to hear from everyone else about their worlds, and then we can kind of alternate after that with people giving updates. I know I said in the syllabus that I would meet with each of you individually. If you don't want to do that, or if you don't have time, this isn't like a real class with a university for credit. So if you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. But I'll be emailing each of you individually to figure out if and when you would like to have that meeting in the next few weeks. But aside from that, I will send out this video and the slides after class so that you can have them to look over. And yeah, that's it for class today. I'll be here for the next hour if you have any questions or just want to chat.
Great, thanks.
All right, thanks.
All right, take care, everyone.
Adios.